I'm Rick Bennett, and I'll be talking about how to use light and darks to create volume and dimension in a painting. I grew up in rural eastern North Carolina. My mother would gather us up and we would collect fossils, tramp through the woods, and explore abandoned houses. This is how my love of nature and the outdoors came about. I'm a watercolor artist. I love how watercolor creates granulations and textures, pops of color, and gradation. I started teaching watercolor at Pullen Art Center 10 years ago. Light comes from a source and travels in a line. Because of this, any object directly in line with those beams is illuminated on one side, while the opposing side is in shadow, and something else happens too. A cast shadow is created. Cast shadows contain three pieces of information. It talks about the angle of the light, and it talks about the shape of the object that is casting the shadow. You can see the trees and some of the branches and the shape that is being cast down as a shadow on the surface. And another thing it talks about is the topography of the surface the shadow falls across. So on this little road right here, as it goes up and down and as the bushes come up, the shadows undulate, and talk about that. That happens on faces as well. As a nose, a cheek comes out, as a nose comes up, those are going to talk about the shape of these subjects. Look at this corrugated steel building. As it goes up and down, the shadow follows that and describes the pattern that's coming up and down along there. And one other thing that we're going to talk about later too, but look at the texture in this. The low areas of the pits are shaded. The high areas of the metallic shines. It creates a texture that can be seen in this photo and can be made in your paintings. The main reasons that artists use cast shadows as a compositional tool is, for one, to anchor a subject to the surface. So if you look at the foot right here of this little boy, there's a dark shadow right where the foot touches the substrate, and a cast shadow comes out of it. Look how you can see into that shadow. That's a nice quality. It's only a darker shade of the substrate. You can do a more abstracted painting and use any color you want. But one method is to use the substrate color and darken it just a little bit more, and it tends to look more natural. Look at this foot. The foot is just slightly off the ground here, and you can see the light underneath it where this side is just touching, and then it comes out. Notice the shadow is darkest next to where the attachment is. Another thing that you can use shadows to do is to create a connection among multiple items. So you've got a dot of trees, but one of the things that unifies them is where these shadows come along here, and the trunk of the trees moves along here, comes along here, comes up right there, and it creates a more interesting total shape unified. Another thing is when it's an object like this, light on this side, shadowed on this, the cast shadow adds a volume and an importance to that one subject, and it varies the shape. And I make my fingers work. A shadow will create an area of emphasis. So this dark auditorium with no lights but just a little bit up here creates a contrast between the lightest light here and these dark darks. There's no doubt that in this painting, this is the part you're supposed to start. There's the brightest color, the whitest white contrasting to the darker darks. And then it travels down this area of contrast and here, out the guitar, and the mic takes it back up here. So you have a circle of interest going on in here, but you're using the darks to contrast. Sometimes if your subject is not important enough, just coming in and subtly adjusting what's behind it is going to pull the focus back to where it needs to be and creates an area of interest. On the opposite side, instead of a dark shadow, you can use your whitest and lightest colors behind the subject, and there again, that'll pull the eye to the warmest color, the darkest darks, and it'll allow you to point to where the subject is most important. You'll notice that this is kind of a busy area down here, but I reduced the contrast with a wash across this fence so that it's not as important. It's interesting and fun, but it doesn't pull the eye away from the most important part. You'll notice that there's a traveling granulation, textural effect right in here that I like a lot. There again, this is how you paint textures. You use lights and darks to talk about that shape that makes the textures. So the relative value is the relative lightness and darkness of a color. The colors near it interact, so you need to talk about how light and dark each area needs to be to create the focus you want. Value can represent light and shadow. It's one of the tools that gives a painting dimension. In a representational painting, value plays the role of describing the characteristics of the subject. So the subject, it talks about whether the subject is flat or has volume. And in this case, I'm depicting the volume solely on value because it's all the same color. So the lightest lights come forward, the darkest darks recede, the brightest color comes forward, and the most muted color recedes. So this rooster has volume. You'll notice that the darkest dark is near the lightest light in this area because that's a focal point. This also has the most detail. There's some detail in here. Some of it's not very detailed at all. And but this is obviously the focal point and the starting point. And it rounds the subject. Notice the shadow that comes out also extends the area of the subject and adds an interesting variation to the shape so it's not just a ball in the middle of a page. I love the warehouse district in downtown Raleigh. This barrel is a great subject to paint. It's got some blues and blue grays, and then that's going to go nicely with the oranges of the building behind it. There's rust on there, so that and the building has some things in commonality. This is how I painted it. I made some decisions that were different from the original photograph. I pushed my highlights and reflected areas a little more. I created some larger areas of rust that talked about the oranges that were up here. You'll notice how the cast shadow prevents this from being just a rectangular shape. So you've got a volume created by lights and darks. You've got a shadow that talks about the shape of the barrel, and I simplified some of these areas in here so they wouldn't be so important. Notice that this gives some texture to the ground without it becoming too involved or too detailed. One of the other things that I found in the downtown warehouse area is textures. This rust and peeling paint and layers of paint have a very tactile quality, and it all comes from lights and darks, little pit areas that have give a feeling of being lower and pushed in. There's some spots of peeling paint with there. That is a fun thing to paint, and light creates that. So this is a value scale. It calls it between your 1s and your 10s because it goes from your lightest lights to your darkest darks, and it's a scale, a gradient that happens in paintings. And using your darkest darks, some mediums, and your whites are going to give you that contrast you need in different areas. If you painted with just the center 4 areas of the value scale, it's going to be a flat painting. It's not going to have a lot of dimension or contrast going on into it, and you're going to have some challenges. So including lightest lights and darkest darks in some areas is going to be a very effective way of creating your painting. So we're talking about lights and darks and how it creates volume. So a light traveling in a pattern across this ball is obviously going to be coming in this direction because there's your lightest light and here's your darkest dark, and it creates, and then your cast shadow is also going to be the telltale where the light is coming from. Use that consistently throughout your painting, so each object and area you're painting will talk about this consistently. As an object rounds around away from the direction of the source of light, it becomes a gradient and gets darker and darker as it comes around. And this can be used to talk about that fullness. It resonates in your brain and transmits that information. So your darkest dark, the core of the shadow, is right in this area, right in here. Now, as you get to the actual edge, it's still rounding away from where you're standing, and the reflected light from around it is going to make that just slightly lighter and create a little bit of reflected light in there. Reflected light we're going to talk about in our up there in the person that we'll be talking about. And then you got your cast shadow, remembering that it should not be a black solid like this tends to talk about. It should have some especially on a white surface, is you should be able to see into it a little bit and see what's inside the shadow, because your eye in reality would adjust and see into shadows. So this is me, a painting of me. That's my nose and my eyes. And so the light is coming from this direction. And as my nose rounds around to the backside, there's a gradient that happens. I made it a little more sudden there because it says gestural painting. But it's as it rounds down, your nostrils round down, they're going to get a little darker on the lower side. And the darkest spot is going to be your nostrils, because there are little tunnels going up and there's not a surface to reflect the light back. And then the second darkest spot is going to be generally right next to your nose inside here and in here, because your nose comes out and is a protrusion and it reflects the most light, and then your eyes recede in here, your eye sockets are going down in, so the forehead is blocking some light from hitting the eyes, and the nose is blocking the light. So generally, even in the light lit side, this is going to be darker right in here, and that's going to be darker right in there. So this is a photograph of Ron that I used to paint from. One of the tools you can use is don't name the object. Even if it's a bird, if it's a building, don't use those words, but look at the shapes and talk and observe the shapes. I took a piece of paper and cut out the middle, and notice when you go in and just look, see that line right there of light? You see that more. See that little arc of light on the top of the nostril? You see that? And this becomes a little teardrop shape, and you can see that this is not that thing we're not supposed to say. It is a shape, and you can isolate it. You can see exactly that this is just a slightly down tilted triangle. This is just a thin sliver. This is a thicker, so you can identify how big this is, how this arcs, what the light, look at that light right there. You observe by isolating, not saying, oh, how do I paint a face? You say, oh, look, this nose looks like that. So I took some liberties in painting this. I am not painting a classic portrait of Ron. I am painting a story that talks about the energy and the thought that's going on in his head or coming out from his head. It looks like he's angry. Anyway, so you can take any liberties you want with colors as long as your shapes are correct. And your light and your shadows are going to talk about those shapes. The hottest spot, now his photograph doesn't give me the best information that I know. So you can pull out some better photographs that talk about it, but I know that generally right here is going to have the most light, and the tip of the nose is going to have the most light. And as it rounds under, that highlight disappears and becomes softer. There is light here on the upper lip, and it's going to reflect up to the nostrils. So they're not going to be in as deep a shadow as right here is, or as cast in the eyes in here. There's going to be some reflected light in here. And you're going to observe that when you look at the photograph. And when you zoom in on a spot, you'll see that the nostril has a little reflected light right there and some reflected light there. And it's not as dark as that is right there. So compare your values, look what the shape is, and it will create the volume you need. So, this is a rose. Now I'm going to go to a second painting. I use the same elements of lights and darks, but this painting is about an atmosphere. It's a more pensive painting. It's not as vibrant and doesn't have as much movement as the other painting. It's softer, but you can see that the hottest spot in this is the nose right here. That's the lightest light, and this nostril is lighter than that nostril is. And as it comes under and curves away, it rounds. The same thing happens with the lips. Underneath the lips, as they curve around, and there's a lower spot here that gets quieter. You're gonna have this side is obviously where the light is coming from, is in light. This is cast into shadow. Blues versus warms is a nice combination. I use some permanent rose on this side. Ultramarine is used in there. A little bit of alizarin crimson down there. There's some yellows in there too. A little bit of oranges here and there. Those are the colors I use, but I didn't pay attention so much to the color as the values. Using the warms to look on the inside there. I use a little warms inside that shadow to build it. Some warms in here just to get a unified feel of the whole place. The chin, as it rounds around, and you can notice on both of these, as it chin rounds under, becomes a little darker, and there's a gradation to this as it goes back. This is almost a lost edge. I use just a little bit of change of color between here and there. I use some alizarin here and there to change. There's not much value change, but there's a color change that marks the line where this chin ends and the neck is starting to show. Look at the gradation, the granulation going on in here. That's a thing I like a lot. It's just for fun. It doesn't do anything except talk about the story. So we can use directional light to create lights and darks. Pale values will come forward, darks will recede. Lights and darks can talk about texture, volume, and describe the surface. Shadows can connect shapes. They can anchor a subject, and they can emphasize with contrast. I hope this was helpful. Go to my website, rickbennettwatercolors.com, and there's more tips and links to videos.